David Miller had never been fond of long drives outside the city. The endless highways, the quiet backroads, and the shadowy forests of rural America made him restless in a way that Manhattan never did. But real estate was a business that thrived on exploration. If he wanted to expand his firm into untouched regions, he had to see the land for himself. That was why, on a cold October evening, he found himself cruising through the rugged backroads of Montana. His GPS had gone blank 10 miles earlier, his phone had no signal, and the surrounding wilderness pressed against him like a wall of black trees. He tried to stay calm, but the growing silence outside was louder than any noise he had ever known in New York. His rental car rattled as it climbed a steep incline. The engine groaned, sputtered, and then died completely, leaving David stranded in the middle of nowhere. He muttered under his breath, slammed his palm against the steering wheel, and tried the ignition again. Nothing. Not even the faintest spark. He sat there in disbelief for several minutes, watching his own breath fog up the windshield. The world outside seemed unreal, trees rising like pillars, branches curling in the wind, the air colder than the season should allow. He was alone, or so he thought, but something about the atmosphere told him otherwise, as though unseen eyes were fixed on him from deep within the forest. After a long pause, he stepped out of the car. His shoes crunched against the gravel road as the wind cut through his coat. He considered staying inside, but the stillness gnawed at him. That was when he noticed it. A faint, flickering light far ahead, barely visible between the trees. At first, he thought it was a farmhouse or maybe another traveler. Hope rose inside him, fragile but enough to carry him forward. He locked the car, shoved his hands into his pockets, and began walking toward the glow. Each step into the forest felt like stepping out of reality and into a place that had been waiting centuries for someone like him. The deeper he went, the stranger the forest became. The branches seemed to twist unnaturally, as though reaching toward him. The ground was damp, and somewhere far off he heard what could have been a river, or breathing. The light grew clearer, but it no longer looked like a lantern or a porch lamp. It pulsed, steady yet alive, casting shadows that danced in unnatural patterns. By the time David realized he should turn back, it was already too late. He was in the heart of the woods now, and the silence behind him felt heavier than the mystery ahead. His instincts told him danger lay forward, but his curiosity dragged him further. Then he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a distorted shadow moving against the trees. But as he drew closer, his breath hitched. A woman, no, not a woman, something larger, stood before him. She was at least 12 feet tall, towering above him with an aura that bent the world around her. Her long black cloak shimmered in the dim glow, her eyes reflecting a light that didn't belong to this earth. Her face, pale and sharp, was both beautiful and terrifying, the kind of beauty that unsettled rather than comforted. She tilted her head slightly, as though she had been waiting for him. David stumbled backward, his words caught in his throat. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and resonant, vibrating through the ground as much as through the air. The sound froze him in place. She stepped closer, her shadow swallowing his form entirely. "I can't control myself around you." Her eyes narrowed, studying him like a predator studies prey. "People like you, city men, they don't survive long when they cross my path." Her words carried no anger, only a chilling certainty. David opened his mouth to protest, to ask what she meant, but nothing came out. His body trembled, not from the cold, but from the primal instinct to flee. Yet he couldn't move. For a moment, she simply stared, her massive frame leaning ever so slightly forward. Her expression shifted from menace to restraint, as though she was struggling with some internal battle. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her decision. Finally, she spoke again, softer this time, though no less dangerous. "Still, you won't last the night out here. The cold will kill you, if not the other things that wander these woods." Her lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "Come to my cabin. At least there, I can keep you safe for now." She turned without waiting for his answer, her cloak brushing against the ground like a tide of shadows. David stood frozen, his mind torn between reason and instinct. He should run, he thought. He should turn back, return to his broken car, and pray for daylight. But when he glanced behind him, the path he had followed was gone. The forest looked different, rearranged as though it had swallowed his footprints. Panic surged in his chest. He looked back at the giant widow, already walking away, her form too solid to be a hallucination. Against every survival instinct he had, David followed her. The alternative, being left alone in that shifting, breathing forest, was far worse. Each of her steps shook the earth, yet she moved with unnatural grace, leading him deeper into the unknown. As they walked, David studied her from behind, though he tried not to let her notice. Her size was terrifying, but it wasn't the only thing unnatural about her. Her cloak rippled in ways the wind couldn't explain, as if it were alive. Her long, pale hands glowed faintly, and he could swear he saw patterns etched into her skin, runes or scars, symbols that twisted when he blinked. She glanced over her shoulder once, her gaze pinning him like a hawk pins its prey. "Don't fall behind," she warned, and her voice carried a weight that left no room for disobedience. David quickened his pace, his heart pounding louder than his footsteps. The forest thinned, eventually giving way to a clearing. There, nestled between towering pines, stood a cabin unlike any he had seen before. It was enormous, almost matching her scale, built from logs thicker than his torso. The windows glowed with the same strange light he had seen from the road. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling unnaturally as though drawn toward the sky by unseen hands. She approached the door and paused, turning back to him. For the first time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't predatory. A flicker of sorrow, perhaps even warning. "This place changes people," she said quietly. "It already began the moment you stepped into my woods. Remember that." David swallowed hard, trying to gather the courage to ask who she was, or what she meant. But his voice still betrayed him, cracked and useless. She opened the door, and the warmth of the cabin spilled into the cold night air. The smell of wood smoke and something sweeter, something intoxicating, wrapped around him. She motioned for him to enter. He hesitated, his instincts screaming against it, but the forest behind him felt like a trap waiting to close. With no other choice, he stepped inside. The giant widow followed, closing the door with a thud that echoed like the sealing of a fate. Inside, the air was heavy and warm, but the warning in her words lingered. "I can't control myself around you." And for the first time in his life, David knew he had stepped into a story where the ending might not belong to him. The cabin swallowed David in warmth as soon as he entered, though it was not the comforting kind of warmth one expected from a hearth. This heat was heavy, thick in the air, like it belonged to a place that had never known the cool relief of night. Shadows danced across the log walls as the fire crackled in the stone hearth. But the light didn't feel right. It bent strangely, stretched in places it shouldn't, as though it were alive. David stepped further inside, his eyes darting to the walls. They were decorated not with pictures or familiar trinkets, but with strange markings carved deep into the wood. They glowed faintly, just enough to unsettle his nerves. The giant widow ducked slightly to enter, her frame filling the doorway before she closed it behind her. The thud of the door shook dust from the ceiling beams, and David realized just how fragile he was in her presence. She crossed the room in strides that seemed too graceful for her size, every movement commanding the space. For a moment she ignored him entirely, placing a large black iron pot onto the table. From within it rose a fragrant steam that curled like living smoke. David caught hints of herbs, maybe meat, though the smell was almost intoxicating, dizzying in its sweetness. His stomach churned with hunger, but some part of him whispered that whatever was inside wasn't meant for someone like him. Finally, she turned to face him. Her expression had softened from what it had been in the forest, though her eyes still gleamed with something dangerous beneath the surface. "Sit," she said, motioning to a chair near the fire. Her tone was not harsh, but it was not a request. David obeyed, lowering himself carefully into the chair. The wood creaked beneath him, and he wondered if it had been built for someone larger. His palms were damp with sweat, his heart pounding. He wanted to ask 100 questions. Who she was, what this place was, Why she claimed she couldn't control herself, but when he met her eyes, his throat closed up. She studied him with a strange intensity, like a predator trying to decide whether hunger or pity would win. After a long silence, she spoke again. "Why are you here?" The question was simple, but her voice carried a weight that made David hesitate. He explained, stumbling over his words, about his car breaking down, about seeing the light from the forest, about having no choice but to follow it. He mentioned New York, his business, the kind of life he lived. As he spoke, her expression shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. At the mention of the city, she stiffened slightly, and something in her gaze darkened. When he finished, she was silent for several moments, her eyes fixed on the fire. Then she said quietly, "The city. Always the city." Her voice was thick with something he could not name. Bitterness, perhaps, or longing. She moved closer to him then, her steps slow, deliberate. David felt the ground tremble beneath her weight. She leaned down, close enough that he could see the intricate lines etched into her skin, glowing faintly under the firelight. They weren't scars, not exactly. They looked older, deeper, as though they had been carved into her by something greater than human hands. "Do you know what happens to men from the city when they come here?" she asked. David shook his head, barely able to breathe under her piercing stare. A faint smile touched her lips, though it held no warmth. "They never leave the same, if they leave at all." She turned away again, as though the weight of her own words had exhausted her. David sat rigid in the chair, every instinct screaming to run, but the door behind her might as well have been a wall. He glanced around the cabin, searching for some sign of normalcy. But everything he saw only unsettled him further. Maps on the walls marked with strange symbols, jars filled with herbs and liquids he couldn't identify, bones arranged in patterns that didn't feel accidental. This wasn't just a cabin. It was a place of rituals, of secrets he wasn't supposed to see. He felt like an intruder in a temple built for something far older and darker than himself. The giant widow began to speak again, her voice lower now, almost to herself. She told him she had once been human long ago, before the mountains claimed her. She spoke of a husband she had loved, a man from the city who had promised her a life beyond these forests, but he had left, never returning, and grief had driven her into the wilderness. There, in her sorrow, she had found something, or perhaps it had found her. She did not name it, but she said it had offered her strength, protection, and a way to endure her loneliness. The cost had been her size, her hunger, and the curse that came with it. "I became something else," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the fire. "And once changed, there is no going back." David listened in silence, his fear tempered by a strange sympathy. There was sadness in her voice, a kind of longing that made her monstrous size seem less threatening for a moment. But then she turned her gaze back to him, and the danger returned, sharper than ever. "You remind me of him," she whispered. "Your face, your voice, even the way you sit there, trying not to show fear. It makes me remember things I can't bear to remember, and when I remember I lose control." Her hands curled into fists at her sides, and for a moment David thought she might crush him where he sat. But she closed her eyes, forcing herself to stillness, and the tension in the room eased just slightly. The hours stretched on. David stayed seated, too afraid to move, while she busied herself with the fire and the pot on the table. The smell of the food grew stronger, making his stomach ache with hunger. At last, she ladled some into a bowl and set it before him. The portion was enormous, clearly meant for someone her size, but she slid it toward him as though testing him. David hesitated, staring at the steaming stew. It looked normal enough, meat, vegetables, broth, but something about it felt wrong. He forced himself to take a spoonful. The taste was rich, overwhelming, unlike anything he had eaten before. It filled him with warmth, but also with a strange heaviness that spread through his chest. He set the spoon down quickly, suddenly unsure if eating had been a mistake. She watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "Good," she said finally. "You will need strength." Her words sent a chill down his spine, though he couldn't quite tell if it was a warning or a kindness. The fire crackled louder, the shadows stretching longer across the walls. David felt drowsy, though he wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion or whatever was in the stew. He fought to stay awake, knowing instinctively that sleep in this place would not be safe. She seemed to sense his struggle. "Rest," she said softly. "The forest won't touch you here, not tonight." He wanted to argue, to demand answers, but his body betrayed him. His eyes grew heavy, his head bowed, and before long darkness claimed him. When he woke, the fire was little more than embers. The cabin was silent, though he could feel the weight of her presence nearby. She sat in a chair across from him, her massive form barely illuminated by the dying glow. She wasn't watching him directly, but her head was tilted slightly, as though listening to something only she could hear. David shifted uneasily, the wooden floor creaking beneath him. Her eyes snapped to his instantly, glowing faintly in the dark. "You dream loudly," she said in a voice that made his skin crawl. He wanted to ask what she meant, but he bit back the question. Some answers, he realized, might be worse than silence. The hours until dawn felt endless. The forest outside groaned and whispered, noises that didn't belong to any natural animal. Sometimes David thought he heard footsteps circling the cabin, heavy and deliberate. But each time he glanced at her, she only shook her head slightly, as if to say those were not his concerns. When the first light of morning filtered through the windows, she stood, her figure towering like a monument against the pale sky. She walked to the door and opened it slowly. The forest beyond was still and grey, yet somehow less menacing than it had been the night before. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "Go back to your city," she said. "Never return here. The next time I may not be able to stop myself." David rose unsteadily, his legs weak beneath him. He wanted to protest, to ask what would happen if he ignored her warning, but something in her eyes silenced him. He stepped past her into the cold morning air, the forest stretching endlessly before him. His car was gone from the road, as though it had never been there. Somehow, without understanding how, he found the path leading back toward civilization. He glanced back only once, and in the distance he saw her, still standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching him. Her shadow stretched long across the clearing, a reminder etched into his mind. Whatever she was, whoever she had once been, she was not of his world anymore. He left, his heart pounding, the city calling him back like a lifeline. But deep inside, he knew he would never forget her warning. He had stepped into something ancient, something that still lingered in the dark corners of the world. And though he returned to New York, surrounded by lights and noise, he could never shake the feeling that her eyes still watched him from the edges of memory, waiting for the moment he might return.